So I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Business Science Magazine podcast. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Roger Kaufman. Roger, I'd like just for a minute to read your bio here, just so we can introduce you to the audience. So Dr. Kaufman is a professor emeritus at Florida State University and has served as distinguished research professor at the Sonora Institute of Technology in Mexico. He received ATD's Distinguished Contribution to Workplace Learning and Performance Award. Also, he is a past president, honorary member for life, and Thomas Gilbert Award winner, all with ISPI. Kaufman has published 41 books and 315 articles on strategic planning, performance improvement, quality management, and continual improvement, needs assessment, management, and evaluation. He consults worldwide with public, private, and NGO organizations, the most recent of which include the President and Minister of the Tourism of Panama, the University of Puerto Rico, the Civil Service Commissions of Taiwan, and the Chi-Chain Foundation of Science and Technology, I hope I pronounced that right, as well as the Korean government. At Florida State, he created the Center for Needs Assessment and Planning that did applied research and development. The literature often cites him as the father of needs assessment. The International Society for Performance Improvement has created the Roger Kaufman Award for Societal Impact. This award recognizes the continuous achievements of measurable positive societal impact by an individual or organization. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, as well as the American Educational Research Association. Wow, that was a lot to get through. I am very, very honored to have a chance to speak to you today. Roger, how are you doing?
Well, I'm honored that you choose to speak to me, and I hope you can plow through all that stuff to find content that might be useful to the readers and viewers. So thank you for your role.
No. Absolutely. We were just talking before we went live about how much published research you have. So in preparation for this interview, I went through as much of it as I could, ordered a couple of books on Amazon. So I figured this was this interview at the very least is a net gain for me. I got some extra knowledge, but I wanted to—
Thanks for the business.
What's that? I'm sorry?
I said, thanks for the business.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start, we could start in so many different places, but when we were communicating via email, you sent me some literature that you put together on mega thinking. So I'd actually like to start there with mega thinking and planning. So that's such a bold statement, such a bold title. Can we start off by you explaining what mega thinking and planning is?
Sure. Basically, at its roots is say, let's together create the kind of world we want for tomorrow's child. It's focused on evidence-based results. I identify something that I call an ideal vision, which I got from actually collecting data on perceptions of people from almost around the world about what kind of world do they want for their children and grandchildren. By the way, if you ask them, what kind of world do you want, you get all kinds of process information. But when you ask them about their children and grandchildren, you start getting results. So the ideal vision has a whole bunch of measurable criteria about survival, self-sufficiency, and quality of life that we find out that there's a lot of data available on it. And so that gives you a roadmap, or maybe even better, a North Star towards which everyone can steer. Because the ideal vision is ideal, it means that probably we're not going to get there in our lifetime or maybe our children's lifetime. But if as John Lombardi said, if you're aiming for perfection, which you might get there, at least you might get to excellence. So if you're not getting to the world for tomorrow's child, where everybody in the world is self-sufficient, self-reliant, and not under the care, custody, or control of another person or agency or substance, what do you have in mind? And if you say, well, we'll never get there, some people will just be murderers and criminals or terrorists or so forth. And the answer is okay. Then you come and you pick out those people that's okay to eliminate. So denying it is a matter of triage and what you're willing to allow on your way to perfection. Toyota used to have a slogan about seeking perfection, and that's what I think we ought to do in our business. If we're not here to measure and improve the health, safety, and quality of life for everybody on the planet, what do we have in mind? So that, Jill, is mega, and I hope that isn't too muddled.
No, not at all, not at all. So you just said something that I thought was interesting, where you said, we should be seeking out perfection. Do we get to a point, whether it's societally or within an organization, where the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, where people strive for perfection so much that it could create a problem for shorter term objectives? Do you ever run into that issue?
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is popular, especially among techno nerds, and say, well, the perfection is the enemy. Only if you stop trying to go there. If you say, well, since I can't get to perfection, I won't do anything, or if I can't get to perfection, well, I'll cut corners. Well, that's just giving yourself an excuse not to do what I think, and Moore at the University of Virginia calls an ethical issue. So if you're not going to perfection and want to continually improve, what do you have in mind? Where do you stop? And what is good enough? Is good enough saying, well, it's okay that 1/8 of the world lives in slums. We'll never change that. Well, when there's people who are suffering, then in a way we all suffer. So what's the payoff for not going for perfection? So yeah, I hear the argument, but what I think it's a cop out. It's a cop out because if you say, well, you can never get to perfection, then why go there? No, I say just keep trying to get as close as you can to it. And by the way, that brings up the importance of measurement. Is that if you know what perfection is, you can measure the extent to which you have gotten from current results and consequences to perfection, and that gap in results, which I call a gap in results needs, that gives you a needs assessment, that gives you the data on what to change and what to keep.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the vision there, and something in my consulting practice that I find a lot of clients that we work with struggle with, at least initially, is the difference between the vision and the mission. Can you talk a little bit about how you define ideal vision and how that compares to the organization's mission?
Well, the interesting thing about it is the ideal vision is appropriate for every organization, public or private, no matter where it is in the world. I just ran a class at Florida State University, and there was a really brilliant colonel in there, Marine Corps colonel, Semper Fi, who said, well, I've lived among the Afghani tribes, and what their reality is they're getting subsistence that's okay. Now, does that mean mega doesn't work? And I said, no. What that means is that they have settled for that. Janis Joplin, the New Age singer, had a brilliant insight which said, you are what you settle for. You are what you settle for, which I find really insightful. Now, if you're going to settle for subsistence, that's your decision. But usually you don't think you can, or you don't know that something else is possible. There was an African-American state legislator here in Tallahassee called Al Lawson. While we politically differ, many years ago he came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. He started a foundation called The Other Side of the Mountain. And Al says this. He said, I said, why did you start it? And he said, well, one day I was walking, on the south side of town, which classically is a slum or ghetto. And there's a little girl just sitting on a stoop about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I said, hello, little girl, hello. What are you doing? Nothing. What do you want to do when you grow up? Nothing. Why nothing? How are you going to survive? Government's going to take care of me. And he said, the problem with that little girl and others is they've never seen the other side of the mountain. They've never seen what is possible. So the ideal vision, and it's a minimal ideal vision. Mariano Bernardus likes to constantly call out that it's a minimal ideal vision. And what it says in measurable terms about survival, self-sufficiency, and then quality of life. And that's for everybody, regardless of where you are. It's the other side of the mountain. Now, the mission, and by the way, people flip those two. They start with the mission and vision, right, which is usually a prostitution of the concept, I think. The vision says, where are you headed and in terms of survival, self-sufficiency, quality life. The mission derives from that, based upon a needs assessment. Remember I earlier said the gap between what is and what should be for your journey towards perfection. That gap is a need. Then you harvest those and you say, for your organization, which ones of those needs are you going to take on and commit to deliver and get continually closer to? That becomes your mission. That says, where is your organization headed and how do you tell when you arrive? Linked to the ideal vision. You're not going to get all of the ideal vision, but this is a public statement of where you're headed. Many years ago, I and my son Jack, and now the most recent dean of businesses at Syracuse, looked at statements of purpose for our companies, and we found out they almost never had anything about societal value added, and they confuse mission and vision and for instance, can I give you a war story?
Absolutely.
A number of years ago, and because of that, I ended up on the cover of the Australian magazine Government. I was asked by the Commonwealth government to look at all the strategic plans for all the Commonwealth agencies in Australia. And I ended up reviewing these and ending up in Canberra, where I was sitting with ministers, secretaries, and their number two people. And culturally, Australians love a joke and have fun outside of the meetings. When they're in a meeting, they want to get right to it. And so I said, I took your charge seriously. I've read all these strategic plans. I'm sure Qantas for the quarter made a huge profit because some of them are so large that you got a hernia just looking at them. And by the way, any strategic plan over 10 or 12 pages is probably not a strategic plan or a tactical and operational plan. And I've looked at these, and I said they vary anywhere from terrible to atrocious. And the room got quiet, as you might imagine.
Right.
And I said, but that's not what bothers me. What bothers me is if every agency is doing their own strategic plan, who the hell is doing the strategic plan for Australia? And it got very, very quiet. And then an expletive came out of somebody who was about 11 o'clock in the room, if you look at the face of the clock. And he was head of ministers and cabinet. And later we were talking about strategic planning, which is based upon MEGA, which is based upon societal value added. Later on, I worked with a brilliant number 3 person at the Australian Department of Defense. We actually, because of that, changed the mission of defense forces. And so what you do is the ideal vision is adding value to society.
I like that. I like that a lot. I'd actually like to go back to the example that you gave of speaking to the little girl. And I'd like to draw a link to another book, Change, Choices and Consequences. And there's a line in here where you say, we do make choices. Not making choices is a choice. We can be the master of change or the victim of it. Was that what you were referring to there with regards to making choices, and does that tie into individual responsibility?
Yes, and I got inspiration from that, from one of the two psychotherapists in the last few decades, Harold Greenwald, who wrote a brilliant book which I think captures all of psychotherapy. It's out of print. It's called Direct Decision Therapy. If you can find it out of print, I suggest everybody read it. Because what it does is it talks about your personal mental health and well-being is based upon the choices you make in life. And so Harold pointed out, I wish I had thought of it. I didn't. He did. He said, not making a decision is a decision. And when you think about it, he's right. And so when we decide not to add value to society, that's a decision. When we decide we're not going to do anything about it, that's a decision. And of course, we are what we do and accomplish. And so you're responsible. Everybody's responsible for the decisions they make. Let's go back to Janis Joplin for a minute. Not my favorite person, but a great philosopher. You are what you settle for. Again, it's about decisions that you make. And let me bounce something off of you, if you don't mind interacting.
No, absolutely.
Very early in life, when I was going to Hopkins, which was probably the best doctoral experience I ever had, I studied under a learning psychologist by the name of Jim Deese. And all the time, I never knew he was a behaviorist. He pushed on me and others to think for themselves and come up with their own model. And later on, my next stop was at Berkeley, which wasn't at all behavioral, but Gestalt. And I got to study with some of the greats. And I found out that, gee whiz, there's things that go on inside people's heads which filter things. And then I later that Woodward and Schlossberg talked about stimulus organism response, because somewhere in this head, stuff is going on that does filtering. And I've come to a conclusion which may be simplistic, and I'd like to bounce off of you with your experience, is that the behaviorists were really right at the core. That what we do and continue to do or don't do is based upon the rewards or reinforcements that we get or don't get. And these things compound to bigger and bigger issues. And the same reinforcement theory works for hypothesis, works for individuals, small groups, divisions, departments, organizations, governments. It's all about the pattern of reward and what gets rewarded. Now, how far off base am I?
No. I don't think you're off base at all. In fact, I think that's a great segue into my next question. But yes, I totally agree. We're a product of not just our current environment, but our past environment, our history of conditioning, our history, as you said, of rewards. I think, and I think it's such an interesting topic with regards to choices. And I see this with a lot of organizations that are behaviorist-based organizations, behavior analysis, behavior science-based organizations, where we all understand that our behavior or how we perform comes from how our performance has been shaped and reinforced or shaped and rewarded in the past. But I think that there's a disconnect with regards to choice and responsibility. And I really love that line when I was reading through your book where you talked about being a master of your change or being a victim of it. And I think that you get such better performance when we communicate and subsequently reinforce the notion that people are in charge, or they're capable of arranging their environment, their own environment, to improve their own performance. I know that was kind of a long lead in there, but does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the data are pretty clear that when people in an organization know where they're headed, why they want to get there, how to know when they arrived, and how they can contribute to that and buy into it, you get effective organizations. When you get people who don't know where they're headed or are going in different directions than where the organization is headed, then you get this chaos and conflict. You can see this in government right now. People are arguing about international policy. And the question is, I, as a State Department person, don't agree with the President of the United States. Well, you know, who is the policy maker for the world, whether you like, whether it's Obama or Trump or is it going to be Hillary? The question is, who makes the policy? And the question becomes, do you agree with that policy? If you don't, what do? Do you sit around and sabotage it? Well, some people, that's what they do. And so this getting agreement on the mission based upon the vision is essential for organizational and individual effectiveness. And I think in terms of government effectiveness too. It's a value chain which all depends upon agreeing on where we're headed, why do we want to get there, how do we know when we arrive, and buying into it, and then realizing each person in that organization what they can uniquely contribute to that. Because the unique performances of individuals have to add up and integrate to what the organization delivers outside of itself, and the utility, usefulness, the value of it outside to external clients and ultimately to society. Did I avoid that too badly?
No, not at all, not at all. And I've got so many follow-up questions. I'm trying to organize them all here, but so I'd like to see if I can draw a parallel between government and society and organizations. So what you've been talking about here, and I totally agree with that, you know, you kind of start with a grand vision, something very ambitious. And then as you said earlier, you derive the organizational mission from that. And from that, you derive organizational objectives, short and long term. And then from that, you can derive department missions and objectives and goals, and then individual job missions, objectives and goals. Would you agree that that's a good?
Yeah, I wouldn't call them mission. I would call them, you know, performance requirements. Because if everything is called a mission, then nothing is a mission. So anyway, I'm obsessive compulsive with a hierarchy of results. Mega are societal value added. Macro are organizational consequences. Micro are individual and small group results and consequences. And by the way, from that, I've recently suggested from a 5:15 in the morning insight, a hierarchy of planning and a needs assessment hierarchy based upon what I call the organizational elements, which are outcomes, mega results, outputs, which are macro results, products, which are micro results, processes, and inputs. There's 5. 2 of them are deal with resources and means, 3 levels of results. And if you plug in at any level and start and fail to link up and down the chain, then you get sloppy results. And so I'm sorry to take off on that, but I don't think individuals have missions, nor do I think that groups within them they do. To me, they have performance requirements that link to the mission, which then links to the ideal vision.
No, absolutely. And I think you just touched on a few things. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Maria Malot's book. It's called Paradox of Organizational Change, but she does a great job of talking about some of the things that you were talking about there. So macro contingencies versus micro contingencies, receiving systems and the feedback that goes from one system to another. But I'd like to...
Yeah, Dale Brethauer has moved me to appreciate her. By the way, Dale and I have an article coming out about design thinking. Is it new or not? By the way, I think Dale is one of the underappreciated professionals in our field. I think he's got a great mind, and he's always. I have not met Balat, but he's always referred to her.
Yeah, she's done a lot of great work, and I will definitely check that article out. So I want to jump back to Society and Government, where you talked about shared values, and I can't remember which book it was, either The Manager's Pocket Guide to Mega Thinking or the Change, Choices, and Consequences, but you talked about having shared values. So, and I think it's in the Change, Choices, and Consequences book, you talk about shared societal value added frame. What happens when the members of either a society or organization don't agree on the direction and don't agree on the value? And how can that be fixed?
Well, I'm sorry, my picture went out. I don't know what happened. Are we still?
Yes.
I have you now. There I am at the top. Are you okay with the picture?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me look at yours. Give me that question again. I was distracted. What happens when you get a disagreement about the vision and the mission? Is that your question?
Yeah, and you talk a little bit about the shared societal value added frame. And I was thinking about that really with regards to society and governments, but I would imagine you see government and organizations as similar entities, just one maybe a little bit bigger than the other. But what happens when you don't have a shared vision or values, and how do you correct that, especially at that level?
Well, you get Washington, D.C. now. You get chaos. And what you do is, again, it goes back to what people get rewarded for. There's some appearing data that corruption is alive and well around the world. And so what these people are doing is, that's their reward system, that's their reinforcers, and they're going to manipulate everything in the meantime to get there. And by the way, my reading of the Quran, and because I don't read it in the original, it might be defective, is that you say or do anything that you have to get the result that you want. And that's what happens, is that people lie and cheat and steal. The thing that bothers me the most is when they're lying and cheating, that they really start to believe it. So what you do is, unless you get totalitarian governments, like you see in Russia and China and Venezuela, the people are forced to think and act in a certain way, or there's very severe consequences, like death. In the democracy, which is, a very, very imperfect model, but the best we've found, you have to deal with these kinds of differences. And I think you do that by, again, the reward system. What reward system do we put in for sabotaging your government or your party or your nation? And sometimes you get elected to office, and sometimes you get embarrassed. I have this strange hypothesis that, excuse me, the people of the world would get along great if we could get the governments out of the way. And governments tend to shape things for their own power. And every once in a while you find somebody who says, I really want to do something for our country and our world. And they get really severely punished by those people who know, I want my pockets to be filled. And so you get chaos. And chaos I think is a price we pay for democracy.
Well, let me ask you this, and usually we try to steer away from political discussions on our podcast, but I can't help myself with a couple of questions because we've been flirting with that topic a little bit here. So I'd like to have a quick discussion about the difference in the benefits and values between changing things at the organizational level versus individual responsibility. And I think that's something that we've been kind of skirting around here for a few minutes. So within an organization, how do you balance those two by having the people, let's say in the C-suite or upper management, arrange the environment so that people behave differently, or have individual performers arrange their own environment to perform better? How do you balance those two?
You're not going to like my answer.
Okay.
My answer is yes. You have to do both.
No, that would be my answer too.
And I think what it is that, again, it's this alignment that you have to get. And if you don't get the alignment, you have people going off in doing what they find rewarding or satisfying. And so, to me, a trick of leadership is getting two things: getting people to do what they wouldn't do ordinarily without your reward system or your encouragement. And the other thing is to set together where we're headed, an agreement on why we want to get there. And if you don't get that alignment, you get chaos. And one of the wonderful discussions that I had with a fellow by the name of Peter Sharp, an Australian #3 person in their Department of Defense, and he and I politically, diverged. But boy, did we have some great discussion. And one of the ones that we'd never got resolved, and 2 weeks ago, without my permission, he passed away. The question in Australia: does a government worker work for the government of the day or for the people of Australia?
Right.
And I think everybody does that. For instance, one of the problems that people have had with some MBAs is they suggested they taught people how to further their own career while screwing the organization.
Right.
That's not all MBAs, but that was some of them, and that's why they went on a vote for a while and came back. The question is, do they work for themselves or do they work for the organization? And I think the secret to true success is you've got to do both. You've got to add value, and I say all the way up the hierarchy.
So is that where alignment comes in, where the organization's mission should be aligned with the individual performers' goals and objectives?
Yes, and with the vision. And by the way, I would put that as a hiring criteria, and I would also put that in for HR reward system.
So, and I think based on your last answer, I think I know what your answer is going to be to this, but I'd like to talk for a minute about the unit and level of analysis. So when going in to implement change at an organization, is the unit and level of analysis the organization or the individual performers, or both?
Why do you keep leaving out society?
Because society usually, we usually end up down a political path. So yeah, I think I did that carefully, yes.
Well, look, the Australians have a great definition of a politician. They say a politician is somebody who, as soon as they see the light at the end of the tunnel, quickly builds more tunnel.
Right.
Okay. Uh, the, the problem with most politicians is that they're running on a reward system for them.
Right.
And the question is, political scientists keep telling us, well, we get the kind of governments we deserve. If we, and by the way, I have problems with all political parties to the extent to which they are not focused on adding value to our society and our shared world. And again, that's why the ideal vision tries to get above that fray. And I think the truly successful people are those who not only do well for themselves inside of an organization, but are add value. Look at the successful entrepreneurs like Musk. It's obvious the guy is brilliant, and obviously the guy makes mistakes, and obviously, like everybody else, he's got flaws in his personality. But what's he doing? He's developing stuff that adds value. He's doing stuff which are environmentally friendly. And so what he's doing is saying, why do you want to pollute the world? And so he's working on those. At the same time, he's going to make money. Those people who say, I'm just going to make money or power for myself, their half-life is getting shorter and shorter. The half-life of dictatorships are getting shorter and shorter.
No, absolutely. And I think that there's value in pursuing what's meaningful as opposed to what's expedient. But I would also say, too, that entrepreneurship at its core, I think, is entrepreneurs are problem solvers. So a successful entrepreneur, I would imagine, would successfully solve a societal problem. So I think that there's a bidirectional relationship there between society and an organization. If a particular organization fails to solve a societal problem, it's going to go out of business. And I think a perfect example of that would be something like Uber and taxis. So taxis are going out of business, not necessarily because they're going out of business, but they put themselves out of business. They're no longer solving a problem in an efficient and effective way like Uber is. You agree?
Right. Well, another example is Sears should have been Amazon.
Right.
They had the blog, they had everything in place, but they didn't see that they had to add value to their external clients. Absolutely. They were looking at the quarterly profit and loss sheet, and they were solving problems at a lower level instead of saying, let's move it up the chain. What can we add outside of ourselves? And so, and by the way, I think some entrepreneurs not only solve existing problems, they identify problems and opportunities not yet identified. And so time it's opening this space. For instance, Airbnb created something where nothing existed. Uber, in some ways, did the same thing, and Lyft did the same thing.
Absolutely.
They found out there was a hole there that could be filled, and you could make money at the same time. And by the way, doing good and making money should not be mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they have to be aligned and integrated.
Absolutely.
And that's where a lot of people go wrong. They optimize on the quarterly P&L sheet. And we've seen, dozens and dozens and dozens of great organizations that have gone bankrupt because of that old model of optimize quicker, faster, better, and optimize your quarterly P&L sheet, and didn't look at, the yearly P&L sheet, the 5-year P&L sheet. If I can give you another war story, I was on a public radio broadcast in Australia, and there was 3 people on there. The hero of it, I don't remember his name, but he was a professor at a university. There was that guy, there was me, and then there was the guy who was head of tourism for Tasmania. And so the question came to me because I was the visiting fireman. They said, what kind of planning horizons do you think, planners should have? And I said, at a minimum of 10 years, and if not 25 or longer. And the guy from Tasmania just dissolved in laughter. He said, well, that's a bunch of very, very BS. I said, hell, I can't even predict this afternoon. And so I have to do it with very, very rapid response. And the professor, boy, do I wish I remember his name. He said, do you know what the planning horizon for Fuji Films is? Both said, we don't have a clue. He said 100 years. And again, the guy from Tasmania dissolved in 100 years. And he said, do you know why it's 100 years? Because they expect to be in business 100 years from now. And if they're not planning for that long-term horizon, they probably won't get there.
Absolutely. I think you
again, that alignment with, what I call, the hierarchy of planning. I think that's so essential, because for comfort we keep wanting to drop down to the workplace, and it's not that the workplace isn't vital. In fact, it's the building block of everything. But the question is, what are you building? Is it something the other people in the organization can use and put together to deliver outside of itself? And when that's macro, and when they deliver it outside of themselves, does it add continuing value? And if not, you don't have a business. And so again, just saying, well, let's just look at the organizational objectives. Let's stop at the business plan. If the business plan doesn't link to vision, you may as well buy your funeral box.
Yeah, absolutely. In the examples that we talked about there, so Amazon, Tesla, Uber, all of those companies were in the red for a very long time. Uber is still in the red. Amazon was in the red for, I think, the first 10, 12 years. So people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk had the very vision that you were talking about to see beyond a 3-year P&L statement and say, you know what? I'm sure Jeff Bezos sat down and said, we're building out infrastructure and a logistics plan here that's going to take up a ton of market share. It's going to solve a ton of problems. I can't imagine what I would do without Amazon Prime. I order something and I get it the next day versus, like you said, Sears, where I either have to drive to the store or order it and I get it in 2 weeks. So
you have better luck with Amazon Prime than I do. My last 2 orders were late. The latest one came, which is supposed to be next day delivery, 5 days late.
Really?
And when I complained, they said, well, we can give you a $10 credit. I said, no, you don't understand. What's the value of Prime? And again, people have to fix this. And by the way, when you deal with call centers, the call center person has to have a notion of, not only do I get this person off my back, but what's good for the future of the organization. There's a very, very famous hotel chain that everybody who meets a customer has discretion to spend without permission $500. And the idea is make the customer happy, because that investment is small compared to the cost of doing business, the cost of customer acquisition. But because the reward system is down on the individual rather than the individual that adds value up the value chain, we get really, really strange things happening. And again, if you don't get that alignment, you don't have a sustainable operation, public or private. What does the government do when an organization fails to deliver? Well, they create another organization in parallel to do it. They don't get rid of the old one. That's expensive, and we can see it in budget deficits. But again, to me, it's so simple. And I know I'm deluding myself. It's about the reward system and whether it's mutually beneficial or just aligned towards an individual or a small group.
Absolutely. And, I'd like to quote Maria Malat here again, where she talked about one of the contradictions that she talks about in the paradox of organizational change is that change itself is chaotic, it's complicated, but the process of change, what you're referring to, reward systems, is simple. And I think a lot of people nowadays in business try to go in one direction or the other. They say, well, you know what? We're going to take care of our customers and the employee be damned, or vice versa. I'm going to make sure to take care of my employees regardless of whether the customers are okay or not. And I would imagine that's where alignment comes in as well, is we need to make sure that the organizational values and objectives are in line with taking care of the customers and the employees, right?
Yes. Let me say a yes and. I don't know whether you ever met Bob Carlton.
No.
Bob Carlton was one of these thinkers that people didn't realize how smart they were. And I recruited Bob Carlton to write a book on organizational change when I was putting together a six-pack for HRD Press, which is still out there, and Bob Carlton's book is there. And one of the things he said to me, and he said, you know, change can be really rapid. I said, come on, Bob. Everything I've learned is change is chaotic and it takes time and there's resistance. And he said, you know, if you go back and you look at things, for instance, the old model of education is two people on a log. Well, that changed the 8th grade classroom in less than a decade because that's where the rewards were. I said, okay, what else? He said, well, how about the Walkman? I mean, the Walkman, that really took things on fire, and we're still walking around with those things, and they morphed into the smartphone. I mean, these changes were really, really fast, and his statement, which I agreed to him, I had to change my thinking, is that if you find the right incentives, things can really change. And that's the problem with most HR systems is they look at people as unitary. And there's these damn individual differences that keep coming up. And you have to find those rewards. A winner of the recent Roger Kaufman Award, ISPI Award, was 3 authors from Harvard and MIT who talked about the wealth paradox. And that goes together with a recent Nobel Prize winners in economics. Is what they're finding out is giving money to the poor doesn't do any good, and sometimes it makes matter worse. But what if you teach people to be entrepreneurs? Not only do they lift themselves up, but they lift other people up. Joanne Roll, who is Dean of Business at Medgar Evers University, is doing that with 3 groups in the Caribbean and in Africa. And they're teaching, and they mostly turn out to be women, how to be entrepreneurs. And that's lifting them out. They change their reward system, and therefore change the reward system of others. They point out that people in poverty are really entrepreneurial, but they don't know it. They found a way to survive against all odds. They create things which to us are primitive, but to them it's very creative on what they end up doing. You know, who would ever think of using dung for fuel? Well, this is an entrepreneur who decided he didn't want him and his family to die of the cold. And so when we look at the reward system, again, it can be chaotic if you don't do the fine-grained analysis of individual differences and their different schedules of reinforcement or payoffs, and do the same thing for organizations and managers and society. If you do that, and I think Bob Carlton is right, change can be very, very rapid. It's chaotic when we don't have agreement on where we're headed and why we're going there.
Oh, and I think you just very eloquently illustrated a big part of the problem with our politics right now is a lot of people don't agree where we should be going, and it's difficult to establish that alignment because of that. That's a huge problem. It's not just, I think a lot of people agree, yes, things need to get better, but they don't agree with the direction that we're going.
Well, and they don't define better and for whom. And so what they do is, because there's no clear understanding of shared purposes, they argue about process and means and resources. And of course, our education system has carefully taught people over the years not how to think, but what to think. And so the whole idea of arguing over process, yeah, that makes sense. So we beat ourselves up over, one method that we use. Do we have closed investigation? Do we have open ones? Do we fund this or that? These are like, treating brain tumors with Band-Aids. And we think, well, if we increase the quality of the Band-Aids or the size, things will get better. But no, we haven't looked at the underlying, which is adding value. And adding value to whom? And if we realize that we do it up the value chain, to input to process to micro and a macro and a mega, you find out that things get much more efficient. They get much less costly, and you get better results.
So then would you argue for a smaller bureaucracy in general, whether it would be at an organization or at a government level, that trains people to how to think, not what to think, and gets out of their way? So that was great advice I got from an organizational behavior management consultant years ago, is set up the contingencies at the organization that you work with and then get out of the way. So would you?
And define jointly what is success, and then get the hell out of their way. You fire them because they know they have skills. If you only hired people that had the same skills you do, they wouldn't have to have you, or you wouldn't have to have them. What you do is you hire people because they can add value on different things. And I think that the literature is very clear, is if you get agreement on the purpose and get out of people's way, they do great work. But when you micromanage them, then the rewards come from making the boss happy and not necessarily about getting valued results. So I think, again, I think this is the way in which you define leadership and convert that, line that with management. So yes, I agree with you.
Yes, absolutely. I think our society is becoming more and more entrepreneurial. We see more and more freelance websites out there where people can go off and find their own work, do their own thing. So usually when we get to the end of the interviews, we like to just do a little piece here at the end where we talk about what's up next for you. So I'd like to ask, just in general, where can listeners find you next? Are you doing any talks coming up soon? Any presentations? And you said you've got an article coming out?
Yes, it's going to be in the November-December Performance Improvement Journal. Again, that's the article with Dale Breathauer. I guess I've been overactive because in the last 6 months I've had 5 journal articles come out, and unfortunately I'm not hearing much ridicule yet. The recent stuff that I've been thinking about and I'm pushing more on is the hierarchy of planning and needs assessment hierarchy to get people to align. This Saturday we're going to Hermosillo for the Roger Kaufman Award, where it's being accepted by the governor of Arizona and the governor of Sonora, Mexico. After that, I don't know. Make a suggestion. I'm open for bar mitzvahs and weddings, and yeah,
it must be surreal to talk about an award named after yourself. So I keep hearing you say the Roger Kaufman Award. That's very cool.
Well, I'm both astonished and honored at the same time. And I thank ISPI and the ISP board. I think ISPI is trying to expand its horizon. I think it could use the support of past and present and not yet members to talk about and contribute on exactly the same things you've been covering here, and you're covering in your work. I don't know what the future holds for me. I'm blessed with having the best partner a guy could ever dream of, and so I give her a lot of credit for anything I've accomplished, and she deserves none of the blame. And I also thank people like you and others who come and ask me questions to which I can give silly, non-responsive answers. But that also keeps my head going. So the future is probably writing articles. I don't know. Let me ask you a question. Do people read books anymore? I don't think so.
Well, people listen to books. So there's been a big shift, and that's, again, thanks to places like Amazon, again, that have audiobooks. So we were actually just had an internal meeting for Business Science Magazine recently where we were looking at the data, and although people are still reading books, they're not reading as many, but they are listening to more books. So, and I think that it's really becoming almost a Gutenberg revolution where people can do two things at once. They can be driving and listening and learning, or they could be doing manual labor. So maybe somebody that's works somehow in manual labor, if they work in construction, they could be listening and learning while they're doing their job.
Unfortunately, attention sharing, tool processing on tasks turns out not to be a wonderful thing to do.
That's true.
Usually one of them really suffers. I think you're right. I think things like blogs are getting more and more attention. But the question is, where do you find them? Publishers, maybe the Business Science magazine can do something in this area, because publishers only want to publish stuff that have big sales. And what do? Well, you stay within the conventional wisdom. You don't push any horizons. You don't push the envelope at all, because what that means is you lower the possible client size. Because
Right.
a lot of people in our field and everywhere else is interested in bias confirmation rather than challenging.
Echo chambers. Everybody wants to live in an echo chamber where what they say gets reinforced. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I congratulate you on setting up this new contribution, which is the reason why I've just working here, because I think it's got great potential. Is how can you broaden the horizons of people and what's available to them in a form to which they will buy and pay attention to. Let me know what you come up with.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal, is to disseminate. And, if we need to use newer technology to do that, that's how we're going to do it. But Roger, I just want to say thank you. It was an honor to be able to speak with you, and we will be talking to you soon, hopefully. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and Roger, thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you for the honor of inviting me.